Hello and good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, with our ongoing series on political geography, today we would be talking on nation, state and nation-state. And for this very discussion, we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Krishnendra Meena. Dr. Krishnendra Meena is Assistant Professor in School of International Studies, JNU. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Krishnendra Meena, and let's try to grab maximum knowledge on the topic, nation, state and nation state. Hello sir, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you Geetika for an introduction. Before we begin the lecture on nation state and nation state, we should also understand that the same in historical perspective. The concept of nation, that is, because states are an ancient phenomena, but there are two views about nation, whether it is an ancient phenomenon or a very modern phenomenon. So there is a large group of scholars who argue that nation is as old as ethnicities are, or as old as ethnies are. But there is another group which argues that nation is purely a modern phenomenon and it is a product of capitalism or industrialism and bureaucracy, and therefore an outcome of modernization. So therefore, nationalism comes before nations for modernists. And the primordialists, or the scholars who argue that nations are an ancient phenomenon, they argue that nations were forever there and they are still existing in their new forms, but they have existed since ancient times. Somewhere in between are people who argue that nations are a phase, just as cities were and just as empires were. So there was no phase in between the cities of the ancient cities of Greece and Athens, and there were no there was Greece and Athens, and Roman Empire was an empire based on the city-state of Rome. So there was no intermediary between these two categories, as cities directly expanded onto empires. But that is the issue at stake today in this lecture, and I hope I'll be able to do justice to the topic at hand today. So students, let us learn more about nation state and nation state. The word nation has its origins in the Latin word natio, which literally means birth, and this word natio was later on picked up by the French language, in which old French nation also means birth. Another form of the same in French is naissance, and which means place of origin. So a mixture of place of origin and birth is the etymological history of the word nation, and we still see that there is a close linkage to how we understand nation, as not only as place of birth but also as place of origin, because most of our nationhood is based in the citizenships we acquire. Right? Later on, in late 13th century, the term was introduced into English, meaning blood-related group, which later related to inhabitants of a country. So the gradual transformation it went on, because since birth also relates to being related by blood, it carried on for a long time like this, and to a country, because in the medieval phases in the late 13th century, countries were still smaller areas, and wherein the linkages or the relationships between kith and kin could be established through blood. So that was the meaning which it acquired in the 13th century. Medieval universities, it was used for communities of students, with the gradually changing meaning of the word to a community of opinion purpose. Initially it started as a community of students, but with its gradual evolution during the medieval period, it was understood that an opinion could also form a nation. A community of opinion and purpose could also form a nation. During the same period, the late Middle Ages, there were religious councils which also used the word nation. And once I must also remind you that during the Roman era, the term nation was used very derogatorily, because it was the Roman Empire which was more important. It was the city of Rome which was more important. What lay outside of the Roman Empire and Rome was nations, and it was not used in a very positive sense during the Roman Empire. So it had attained some derogatory connotations, and later on, with the use by the church, with the use by the religious groups, it gradually came to be recognized with people. And the word nation has since then been in use for a long with greater intensity since the 18th century now. And whereas the word nationalism is more recent. We will examine all these issues as we move on with the definitions of nation which we have with us. Definitions of nation can again be divided, going by the discussion before the discussion we have just done. We can divide the definitions of nation into two categories. One is objective definitions, which include language. Nations are built on the basis of language. Ethnicity, wherein people feel that they belong to the same ethnic stock. Religion, people congregating, people coming together, people worshipping similar scriptures, similar gods also come into picture, and they also form nations. People living in particular territories, they also form nations. People who have common history, shared descent, for example, shared ancestry, kinship, common culture, are part of these objective definitions. So these definitions which use these terms, language, ethnicity, religion, territory, common history, shared descent, they all form part of objective definitions. One can cite an example by Stalin. So he argued that a nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. So all the elements of an objective definition are there in Stalin's work. You have a historically constituted community of people which has a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup. But within these definitions, in objective definitions, it can be understood that most of the indicators which are used to call a people as a nation or to form a nation are measurable in nature. They can be measured, and that's why it has been called an objective definition. Perhaps one can also call them empirical definitions, or in some senses a positivist definition. As opposed to the objective definitions, we have subjective definitions, which have more abstract criterion as their indicators. For example, solidarity. Solidarity indicates that there are people who believe in a particular, they have a camaraderie in between them or among them, and they believe in common goals. So they have clearly defined, or even if not clearly defined common goals, they have solidarity within this group. They have this awareness also that they are a self as opposed to any other, as opposed to any similarly formed nations. And loyalty is also another important aspect of these subjective definitions. So we pledge our loyalties to different symbols, different ideas, different groups, and they also become then a part of the nation. Some people have argued that nations form because there is a collective will involved. People pool their will for a larger cause. So collective will is also an important indicator in subjective definitions. But there have been definitions we can cite some examples to understand more about what is the subjective understanding of nation. Most importantly, the first to define nation clearly was Ernest Renan in 1882, who argued, who rejected all the objective criterion indicators for being a nation, and argued that, and he provided examples also, and argued that there is a soul, a spiritual principle which is important to form a nation. So he rejected that on the basis of geography, states cannot become a nation, or on the basis of, say, religion, states cannot become a nation, because within nations there are multiple religions. He argued that only on linguistic basis there cannot be nations, because there are multiple languages in a nation. So by rejecting all these objective criterion, he argued that there requires a soul, a principle, a spiritual principle which guides a nation, which is essential to form a nation. Further development, or further, Max Weber argued that it is a community of sentiment which would adequately manifest itself in a state of its own. So for Max Weber, what was important was sentiment of people, or a community formed around a common sentiment, and which would then manifest itself, or which would then fructify itself in a state of its own, or which will become a state, and that will be then the nation state for Max Weber. W. Conner argued that there are people a group of people who believe they are ancestrally related. So belief, again, which is again a psychological condition, which is again cannot be measured properly, which is an abstract condition, was important for W. Conner for a group to become a nation. For Michael Hector, it is a relatively large group of genetically unrelated people with high solidarity. So solidarity again is important for Michael Hector, and he argued that it is not required that people are genetically related to become a nation, and he further extends the definition onto a larger group of people, so wherein large states can be included, states with higher population, territories with higher population can also be included in his definition. But probably the most used definition, or most commonly accepted definition of nation, is by Benedict Anderson, who in 1982 formulated this, that a nation is an imagined political community, and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. So when we look at this definition, there are two important things which come to mind, that the nation is an imagined political community. Nations have to be imagined. They have to be imagined politically within societies, and this is a very political aspect to it. But he also argues that there are two important, it has to be limited, not limited only in the sense of area, but it also applies to a limited number of people, who distinguish themselves from other nations. This imagined political community also wants to be sovereign, or in most of the instances they are sovereign. And this definition is perhaps the most widely used definition in academia, as well as by that encapsulates what we understand by nations today. So it is very useful when we study intergroup relations, when analyzing socio-political situations. What ultimately matters is not what is, but what people believe is. So belief, again, the psychological aspect is very important in forming a nation, and as a subconscious belief in the group's separate origin. So it is argued that the group is exclusive in its origin, and that exclusivity is important for the group to become a nation. And then this nation gradually evolves, this group gradually evolves to acquire a common national psychology to become a nation, or a psychology which is dominant or prominent in the larger section of the population. That is how a nation is formed. And this is what largely nation is about. If we were to critique both these subjective and objective definitions, we will find that there are multiple critiques which can be offered to both, with examples of course, to both Benedict Anderson's ideas and as well as previous ideas by on the basis of language, religion, culture, shared history or ethnicities. Because if we look at Switzerland today, people consider it, or it is considered as a Swiss nation, but on the other hand it has multiple languages. If we consider a country like United States a nation, then you have a multiple religions there, multiple allegiances there within Christianity also. So all these bases form one group when they acquire psychological character, or when they move towards the definitional, the subjective definitional realm. That is very important for us to understand nation. I hope this makes the definition of nation clear to the students. Now we will move to the second concept of this lecture, that is the state, which is more easy to define than the very delicate subject of nation. A state is commonly understood as an independent country consisting of specific territory and citizens bound by a sovereign government that demands their loyalty. And very important here is that in many cases the government does not always obtain their loyalty. So there are specific characteristics or elements of a state which we need to underline, which we need to understand while understanding what a state is. And within that, with this definition also focuses on these important elements of the state. So it is an independent country that is there, so it is sovereign. It has specific territory, so the geographical aspect is supplied, or it is inherent in the territory which these states occupy. There is a population which is citizens of this particular country. They have a sovereign government, and which is the organization which runs this large state, which runs this large group of people called the state. We will try to focus on each and every element or characteristic of the nation today by looking at them individually in the next few minutes. But first, let us first look at the definitions of state again by two important scholars. Max Weber, the same expert who has elaborated upon bureaucracy, says that state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. So for Max Weber, what is important is that it is a human community, but that human community which legitimately can use physical force within a given territory. So it has the elements or characteristics of the state there, like human community, it has legitimacy, it has given territory. But the important distinguishing aspect is the monopoly of use of physical force or violence within this particular territory is what Max Weber focuses on. Michel Mann, a very important contemporary scholar, he is again a sociologist. He wrote this very important work on the state, origins of the state in 1984 to be precise, and he argues that any definition of states should incorporate a number of different elements. So the state has a set of institutions and their related personnel, and which are manifest in the various institutions, various organizations which are considered government or called as government. It has a vast network of bureaucracy which is manifest in the related personnel, through which the state carries out its most important tasks, like taking care of law and order, like taking care of revenue collection. All these functions of the state are carried out through these set of institutions, or legislative work, executive work. All of it is carried out by these set of institutions and their related personnel. So that is the organization which is an important characteristic of state. The second important aspect or element is that the state needs to have a degree of centrality with political decisions emanating from this center point. All the states, most of the states have a capital, whether it is located centrally in the geographical formation of the state or in the geographical circumstances of the state, but it has a capital which is the center point, and from where all the political decisions emanate. And it has a degree of centrality. So what is supplied from the state, from that center, what is decreed from that particular center is spread out throughout the territory of the state. The fourth important aspect of or element of the state is, according to Michel Mann, is a defined boundary that demarcates the territorial limits of the state. All states have a territory. There is no state in the international system which does not have a territory. No one can cite an example that there are states without territory. So, and that is the most important geographical aspect of the state. The most tangible aspect of the state is geographical. That is, it has its territory. Furthermore, the state also sets limits on its territory. So it regularly monitors what comes within the limits of the state and what goes out of its limits of the state. In terms of economy and trade, it is manifest in the export and import of various goods and services, and emigration and immigration in people. The state also controls, by defining these limits, the inflow and outflow of ideas from the territory of its territory. Also, the last important element of the state, as defined by Michel Mann, is again similar to Max Weber, that the state also has a monopoly of coercive power and law-making ability. States, institutions like the police, like the military, like executive, they all have some have coercive power through legislation, through making laws. Some have coercive power by using physical force. So these are two very important definitions of state explained by two very important scholars. Let us move on to understand the different elements of state in detail. We should look at all these elements from a geographical perspective, since this is a class on political geography. So the most important part of most important element characteristic of a state is its land territory. A state must occupy a definite portion of the Earth's land surface and should have more or less generally recognized limits, even if some of its boundaries are undefined or disputed. It goes without saying that all states have a territory. There are no states without territory. Most of the states, you name any state and they have a land surface on which they are based, from where they function. It is the territorial base from where they function in times of peace and in sometimes also in times of war. And land territory is fiercely protected by any state. You look at any example of war, which has most of the wars hitherto which have happened in the history have happened because there is a conflict over territory, because there was a dispute over territory, because some limits were not clearly defined for a sovereign state, because some territories were not clearly demarcated, because some borders were still to be settled. Most of the wars in the international system which have happened till now have happened because there are no clear definitions. The territory, because territory was involved in it, and this human fascination for territory goes back to private ownership of land. that was later on transformed onto societal ownership and then further on to ownership of the state of land. And this still manifests in various disputes, conflicts which we witness around the world on territory, on the issues of territory, on the issues of territorial occupation and territorial sovereignty. The state also has a permanent resident population. An area divide of people altogether, no matter how large, cannot be a state. A state cannot be without people. It has to have a resident population which stays permanently in this state. Any area only traversed by nomads also cannot be called a state, or seasonally occupied by hunters or scientists similarly cannot be called a state. You can look at the examples. Antarctic is an example which is frequented by scientists for an important part of the year. For 6 months they have a population of scientists which is there to conduct research, and for the colder 6 months there is hardly any population on the Antarctic continent, and that is not a state. Most of the states, in sovereign states, I think there are now close to 50 parties to the Antarctic Treaty, and they have now Antarctic bases who have bases there, and they operate from, they conduct research there, but there is no one state in the Antarctic, because this is not a permanent population which stays there. Further, one must also understand then that state is a human institution created by people to serve some of their particular needs. This takes us back to the definitions of the state as expounded by the social contract theorists like Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, who argued that people pool their will or people pool their will to a certain authority, and that authority is the state which runs, which maintains the law and order situation, which functions as the state, which maintains various other forms of institutions in the state, so that the state functions peacefully. We'll stop here to come back in the second part of our lecture to elaborate more upon this, more upon the remaining elements of the state, and to look at what a nation state is. Thank you. Welcome back, students. Let us now look at the remaining elements, characteristics of the state. Government is a very important element in the state. Without governments, nothing functions. So the people living within a territory must have some sort of an administrative system to perform functions needed or desired by the people. Without political organization, it is argued that there can be no state. And government also functions in a geographical manner, in a geographic dimension. All its divisions beginning, for example, in India, beginning with the smallest village level unit or the panchayat unit to the largest national unit, have a geographically defined area. So you have village which has a defined area, panchayats which have a defined area, subdivisions, tehsils. One can move up the order and you will find that there are various divisions, districts, states, and then further union territories, or then the larger nation or divisions or regions. All of them have a geographical connotations and geographical limits which are clearly defined. So government also functions in a very geographical manner or in a very geographical way. So but it has to be understood that all the states have a very, very important administrative function which is carried out by the government. States are also organized economies. Although every society has some form of economic system, a state invariably has responsibility for many economic activities, even if they include little more than the issuance and supervision of money and the regulation of foreign trade, and even if economic activities are managed badly. Most of the state economies are controlled by governments. States control the economies. States are unit economies in the sense that the definite boundaries of the state contain themselves within them the economies which are called state. For example, Indian economy, Chinese economy, US economy, they are all geographically bounded economies, and these economies are considered to be unit economies because all what is produced within the territory of a state is considered national production or production within the territories of the state. States also determine what goods flow into their territory and what they also regulate what flows out of their territory. So the import and export of goods is also regulated. The people who come into or the kind of services which enter into a particular country and the kind of services which it exports is also regulated by the state. Therefore, it needs an organized economy also, and it also derives a lot of taxation. It exacts taxes, earns revenues through this regulation of economy, and then therefore it also earns for its day-to-day functioning. It taxes people, taxes the population, and then that is how its day-to-day functioning is possible. The fifth important element of the economy is circulation system, which is manifest in various means of transmitting goods, people, and ideas from one part of the territory to another. All forms of transportation and communication are included within this term of circulation, but a modern state must have more sophisticated forms available to it, and this is very, very geographic in nature, because a transport infrastructure, whether it is air transport, rail transport, road transport, or water transport, does have the capacity to transform the larger state. If most of the territory of a particular state is highly connected, then there is a possibility of higher development, higher economic development. So infrastructure is a must, and that too is very geographical in nature. One can now include various forms of communication lines, not only telephony but also infrastructure related to cell phone towers, infrastructure related to internet communication, infrastructure related to say for example transport of oil through various pipelines, which is very, very geographical in nature. All these very important aspects a state requires to understand to actually control this territory within which it lies. And all these important elements are very geographical in nature, whether it is land territory, whether it is permanent resident population, whether it is a organized economy, whether it is the circulation system, all of them have a very, very important geographical connotation. That is, they are totally based in geography. Populations cannot reside in thin air, they need some land surface to live on. Organized economy has to function, industries have to be based on some parcel of land, territory itself has to be there for a state to function. So, and the circulation system is needed for connectivity within this particular state. All of these aspects all of these elements are very, very geographical in nature, and that's why. And since state is a political, very, very political entity or political unit, they are political geography in nature. Most of the state's functions are actually informed by geography, and that is why we can look at our own Indian state and we find that certain parts of our country are considered peripheral because they are either located very far from the center of the country or the functioning center of the country, administrative function center of the country, or in some ways not very well connected with the larger part of the territory. So it plays a very, very significant role. Geography plays a very significant role in the formation of a state. And these 5 elements are purely geographical in nature. Let us also look at 2 of the non-geographical elements of a particular state. Sovereignty, one must understand, that is a very, very important political element of the state. It can be understood that there is a general agreement that a state is sovereign or possesses sovereignty, but no agreement on precisely what constitutes sovereignty. It is again a very difficult term to define. It is also a very delicate term to define, like the nation. In a general sense, if one were to understand sovereignty, it will mean power over the people of an area, unrestrained by the laws originating outside the area, and or independence completely free of direct external control. And so there are 3 important aspects within this understanding of sovereignty. That is that it, in general sense, the state is sovereign in the sense that it has power over the people within this particular territory. And this is unrestrained by the laws originating outside of this territory. The sovereignty is applicable, state sovereignty is applicable on this particular territory, which is defined, which is demarcated with respect to other neighboring states, which are of similar nature, which also claim their sovereign status on their particular territories. They are and the laws which operate outside of this state, outside of this area of the state, do not operate on the area of this particular state. Therefore, it is totally independent, completely independent of or free of direct external control. No states control. Most of the states claim themselves to be sovereign, and there is no direct external control is applicable on the state. However, in a real world scenario, it is very difficult to establish such totally sovereign states, because with this recent phase of globalization, the recent phase and the advent of the recent phase of globalization, in many aspects, sovereignty has been eroded. For example, the flow of information, there is hardly any control of the state on. So in one particular aspect, so the flow of idea is not totally under the control of the state, of many states. In this interdependent world, it is not only the state which determines which goods are flowing into the territory, but also it is determined by international bodies like the United Nations, and its various organizations like WTO and other related organizations like United Nations Environment Program, the Global Environment Facility. Even what industries to be set up or what kind of fuels to be used is sometimes dictated by various external agencies. So it is continuously being argued that state sovereignty is gradually being eroded in today's context. And so, but how far and how it has been eroded, that is still a question which needs to be answered by which still needs a lot of research and which still needs a lot of attention. One can also argue that with the influx of various modes of information, the education policies are also no longer sovereign. They do not remain sovereign because a lot of external influence is there in the ways we are taught, in the ways we speak about various issues in the world, in the country, various issues of various events of international importance and other international phenomena. So, in these senses, sovereignty is gradually eroded. One must, so there is a urgent need to understand, one, the concept of sovereignty itself, or there needs to be a renewed attention to understand this concept of sovereignty, and also to understand how far it is applicable, how far it has been eroded, and how far the states have remained sovereign. All these questions need to be answered only by various research scholars, by academia. Also, the last important element or characteristic of state is recognition. For states or for a political unit to be accepted as a state with an international personality of its own, it must be recognized as such by a significant portion of the international community, that is the existing states. And this again is a very, very important element in understanding a state or for the state, because if there is no recognition by international bodies, by other states, then there is no meaning for such states. So there are many groups within the international system which argue that we are a state unto ourselves, but they do not have political recognition within the international system. That is why we need to understand that a very important role is played by the international community for a state to be called a state, and such recognition comes from formally the most important recognition comes from the United Nations, which is the most important international organization currently in the world. And once the United Nations accepts a particular political unit as a state, then more or less this particular political entity unit is accepted as a state worldwide. Maybe the states which are in some senses considered to be having animosity towards these political units may not call it as a state. For example, Palestine was accepted as a state in very recently, a few years, I think 3 or 4 years ago. So that was the most recent inclusion. Similarly, there are also instances where some parts of a state may become parts of another state, or new states may emerge. That happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and a lot of new states emerged, and subsequently they required recognition from the United Nations. And as and when they were getting recognition from the United Nations, they went on to become states, formal states and politically recognized states. And these states then gradually acquire an international personality of their own. They not only because they have been recognized, but gradually they come to be recognized through their specific particular political situations in the world, particular geopolitical situations in the world, or through their particular specific cultural traits. So you have a lot of states which have been termed, which have been termed as rainbow states, which have been termed as Baltic states, all kinds of states. They have their personalities related to either geography or related to history or some important traditional cultural trait through which they can easily identify themselves, and then they gradually go on to project their identity into the international system. They gradually develop their personality apart from the formal recognition that is by the United Nations. The state also get recognition informally with their respective cultural and informal traits that they have. We'll come now to the relationship between, since again I must reiterate that it is a class on political geography, so we must reiterate how geographers can make a difference to the study of state, and from there to the study of nation and nation state. Let us understand that geographers can help to illuminate the fact that states, when considered at a global scale, vary from region to region. All states are not similar. That is the whole argument. There can be a different kind of states which exist due to, we can create regions which are supranational. We can create regionalization of states which constitutes more than one or two states. We can create this regionalization and can call them as states. Can understand that this is a particular group of states which have similar traits. So regions, we can create regions out of state. And so the next level of, after the level of the state and nation state, is regions, which comes about by a number of states coming together for a common goal, or for cooperation, or for some common objectives which they want to achieve in the international system, and they start to call themselves as region. There can be different kind of states. There are different kinds of states around the world. We can classify them on the basis of availability of different resources. For example, there is a common understanding that West Asian states have a lot of oil and natural gas resources, hydrocarbon resources. We also understand that European Union is a union of states which have come together, which have actually diminished their boundaries. There are hardly any boundaries, which have created a borderless continent. So they have come together, and geographers can identify, so can help us to understand that there are such states, there are such group of states which exists at a global scale. Geographers within particular states can help to highlight the before we go on to this scale, the next argument, I must also reiterate that all these connotations of or these nomenclature of or terminologies of global south, global north, developed countries, developing countries, global triad, core, semi-periphery, periphery, if they are based on development, they are also very geographical in nature. In fact, the global south is defined as global south as the south of 30-degree north latitude. So all states lying south of the 30-degree north latitude are considered as global south, and this is according to United Nations report. So these categorizations, apart from being political, also have geographical connotations. Apart from having economic connotations, also have geographical connotations. So you have a developed world which consists of the most industrialized countries, but there is a developing country which lies in a particular geography. So these meta geographies or these larger divisions of the international system also come about in a geographical nature, and geographers can help to understand that. Geographers can help to highlight the unequal effect of particular policies on different areas within the territory of the state. Geographers can within every state, the state government or the governments, national governments formulate some policies which are applicable to the whole territory, but the effects of them are not uniform always. That difference, that variation in implementation of policies, or the variation in the effect of these policies or execution of these policies can also be understood can also be highlighted by geographers, because geographers are equipped with such tools to highlight regional variation. Third, geographers can also contribute to our understanding of the state because of the state's effort to govern a demarcated territory. This means that geographers can illuminate or can highlight that whether the control of the state is extended to all of its territory or not, whether the most important function of the state, that is control over a particular territory, is carried out by the state effectively or not. From there we have two important aspects which emerge. Territory for state is important in material or physical sense, in the sense that states need to effectively control the territory which they have, the physical territory which they have, and also to be called a state, to be which all this the last one also has connotations of being a nation. State's territory is of key significance in an ideological context. So this ideological part is also explained by the state's emphasis on territory. The nation and state become congruent very easily in a territory. Nations and states identify themselves with the territory, so do the nations, and that's why there is a huge outcry when there are these violations of territorial sovereignty of a particular state. So we have till now looked at the concept of nation, its definitions. We have looked at the state, we have looked at how geographers can understand state, and we also have looked at in some ways the relationship between nation and state. But now let us look at the same in a very detailed manner for the remaining part of this lecture. A nation not only exists as when a state has a unified administrative reach over the territory over which its sovereignty is claimed. So Anthony Giddens argues that a nation will exist only when a state has a unified administrative reach over the territory over which it claims sovereignty. And so a nation state, for a nation state to be existing, there needs to be a congruence between the nation and the state, and the national the political in some. So the ideas of nation state have to be successfully merged, that we an outcome or a fallout of that is that the ideas of nation state have been successfully so merged or so interchangeably used, and we almost treat them as synonymous, whereas that is not the case. States are the formal organizations. States can be defined very clearly in terms of its elements, but we have been using them very interchangeably. And to distinguish it further, we must also understand that the term nation state implies that the cultural and the political correspond. So the political part of a nation state is the state, whereas the cultural part is supplied by or is manifest in the nation. And the people who are ruled, that is the people who are ruled by the institutions of the state, are culturally homogeneous. That is not possible. Most of the times, in fact, there was this study very recently, I think 3-4 years ago, which surveyed 132 states, and found out of that only 12 were nation states. It is very difficult for nations to become states and also the other way around, that is the states to become nations. So that correspondence, that congruence is increasingly difficult to arrive at. It is very difficult to find that states are totally in correspondence with, in territorial congruence with the state or with the nation, or nations are in territorial congruence with the state. And there are ample examples to be found within Asia, within Europe, within various other continents around the world of such instances. And there are only a few nations which have their own state, which can be described as nation states. And in reality, there are only a few in number. It is very difficult to come across such nation states, wherein the congruence is total, where territory and the reach of the state is total, where the cultural nation is equal to the political state, where it corresponds, where both of them are in close congruence. It is very, very difficult to arrive at. One can look at the literature since the last century or so, when the definition of the nation was more than a century ago, when the first time the question was posed by Ernest Renan, and till this moment there is no clear definition of nation. But on the other hand, the definition of state is clearly crystallized, concretized by various studies in sociology, political science, and other disciplines. But it is very difficult to arrive at a clear definition of nation, and because it is the nation as a concept is very difficult to understand. Apart from cultural connotations, it has a lot of psychological connotations which are even more difficult to measure and even more difficult to understand. So the subjective aspect of nationhood or nations is still to be explored fully, and until and unless we as human beings able to do so, we as political beings, we as social beings are able to do so, we cannot clearly understand what nations are and what trajectories they follow. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a deep insight into the topic nation state and nation state. And dear friends, we believe that your feedbacks are very, very important for us. So keep writing to us at info.cec@nic.in, and yes, your questions are also welcome over here. You may send your questions, and we promise you that we will try to solve your questions in the live reset lecture when next time Dr. Krishnendra Meena visits our studio. So till then, take care, goodbye, and yes, keep watching us and writing to us. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.